Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a new deep dive. Today we're taking on a topic that, it touches countless lives but remains incredibly complex. Navigating mental health claims for Social Security disability benefits.
A really fascinating area because unlike, a broken bone you can see on an x-ray, mental health conditions are often called invisible disabilities.
Oh.
And that inherent nature, well, it shapes every single part of the process with the Social Security Administration, the SSA.
Absolutely. And we've got a really rich stack of sources here, articles, research notes, really diving into the specifics of how these claims actually work. Our mission to sift through all this material and pull out the essential knowledge, the key strategies, and maybe the most surprising insights so you can feel genuinely informed about what it takes to successfully pursue one of these mental health SSD claims.
Because proving how a condition like, say, severe depression or PTSD actually prevents you from working, that requires a very different approach than proving a back injury. The documentation, the evidence itself, how you communicate your limitations, it all shifts. It's just different.
So let's jump straight in then. What's the fundamental difference when we're talking about mental health applications versus physical ones?
Well, the core difference is really that need to translate subjective experience, what you feel and go through, into objective evidence the SSA can evaluate. With a physical issue, right, a doctor might point to an MRI scan showing a herniated disc. Clear evidence.
Visible proof.
Exactly. But with a psychological condition, you're documenting symptoms like maybe inability to concentrate or panic attacks or social isolation. Proving the impact of those symptoms on your ability to function and especially to work, that's the real challenge.
Right. And the SSA uses specific guidelines for this. They look at criteria listed in their Blue Book. That's kind of their manual of medical impairments. You have to show your condition meets or equals one of these listings.
Or that its severity functionally equals a listing because it stops you from doing what they call substantial gainful activity.
Which basically means working at a level that earns more than a certain amount each month.
Exactly. And that threshold for substantial gainful activity, SGA, it's important. For 2025, it's set at $1,620 a month. Earn more than that, generally, and the SSA won't consider you disabled.
And the sources even touch on how local factors can play a role sometimes, like in a state like Virginia, just as an example. The accessibility of consistent mental health care can really impact the quality and continuity of the documentation you can gather.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just about having a condition. It's about being able to consistently prove you're getting treatment for it and documenting that treatment.
So let's talk about the conditions themselves. What's really striking is the sheer variety of mental health conditions the SSA recognizes as potentially disabling. It's not super narrow.
No, it's quite broad, actually. The sources break down the major categories and even give us a sense of, how often claims based on these conditions get approved.
Okay, what's the biggest category then?
Well, the largest one we see is depression and other mood disorders, things like major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder. According to the source material, claims citing these as the main issue see around a 65% approval rate, which is, significant.
And what do you need to show for those?
For these, you really need to demonstrate marked limitations in key areas. How you function socially, your ability to concentrate or maintain pace, or even just managing daily life activities.
Sure. What about anxiety disorders? Those seem very common too.
They are. Generalized anxiety, panic disorder, agoraphobia, these are approved slightly less often, the sources say around 58%. And for these, you need clear evidence of persistent anxiety that directly interferes with work tasks or, interacting with colleagues or supervisors.
Then you have conditions like schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders.
Right. These often involve hallucinations or disorganized thinking, and they tend to get favorable consideration from the SSA. The nature of these conditions, well, it frequently causes severe disruptions in thinking and reality perception, making it inherently very difficult to hold down a job.
And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, PTSD has definitely seen increased recognition over the years, particularly for veterans, but really for any trauma survivor. The key there is really detailed documentation. You need to show the trauma, the triggers, and specifically how they limit your ability to work. Maybe you can't be in crowds or have sudden panic responses.
Makes sense. What else is on the list?
Autism spectrum disorders can also qualify, specifically when they significantly impair social communication and interaction, or if they involve repetitive behaviors that would interfere with performing job duties consistently.
And intellectual disabilities.
Those are often strong candidates, usually supported by formal psychological testing showing specific cognitive limits, along with evidence of difficulty managing everyday tasks, independently adaptive functioning, they call it.
Okay. And even eating disorders.
Yes, even eating disorders like anorexia or bulimia. They can support a claim, especially if they lead to severe medical complications or psychiatric symptoms that prevent work capacity.
Now, here's something the sources really highlight. Across all these conditions, there's one factor that seems to dramatically improve your odds.
Yeah, this is crucial. They note that proper documentation, we'll get more into that, and having legal representation can increase your chances of approval by up to 40%.
Wow, 40%, that's huge.
It really is. That statistic alone just underscores how important strategy is in these claims.
So that brings us directly to the bedrock, as you called it, of a mental health claim,
Yeah.
documentation.
Exactly. Because the disability is invisible, your documentation is the visible proof. It has to tell the story.
Okay, so if the documentation is the evidence, what kind of paper trail do people actually need to build? What does that look like?
You need to build a comprehensive file, something that tells a consistent story over time. The absolute foundation is your treatment records. These are the detailed notes from your psychiatrist, your psychologist, your therapist. They should describe your symptoms, your functioning, your mood, how you interact during sessions.
And consistency matters here,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely key. Showing that ongoing nature of the struggle, not just a one-off visit.
And what about medications?
Don't overlook your medication lists and, importantly, any side effects. This does two things. First, it shows the condition is serious enough to need significant medical intervention. And second, it documents additional limitations caused by the treatment itself. Maybe the meds make you drowsy, affect your memory, cause tremors.
Things that also make working difficult.
Precisely. These are all work-limiting factors the SSA should consider.
What about more acute situations?
Hospitalizations or crisis interventions are also really powerful pieces of evidence. An ER visit for a panic attack, maybe a psychiatric hospitalization, or even documenting frequent calls to a crisis hotline. It demonstrates acute severity, instability, and that's highly relevant to your capacity to work reliably.
The sources also mention something called functional capacity evaluations, specifically for mental health.
Yes, FCEs. Think of these as specialized tests. They're designed to objectively measure things like your ability to focus, how you handle stress or interact with others, kind of in a simulated work context. It's an attempt to quantify those invisible limitations.
And you mentioned consistency earlier. The sources talked about a timeline.
Yeah, they emphasize showing documentation over time. Referencing the source material, they suggest documenting treatment at, say, 3-month, 6-month, and 12-month intervals really shows that consistency of care. It paints a clearer picture.
Okay, so beyond the basic treatment notes, what's the most persuasive type of medical evidence in the SSA's eyes? What carries the most weight?
Medical source statements from your treating doctors, especially psychiatrists or psychologists, these carry significant weight, huge weight, actually. These aren't just brief notes. There should be detailed reports where the provider specifically talks about your functional limitations, how you respond to treatment, your prognosis, and crucially, how your condition aligns with the SSA's own disability criteria. They need to speak the SSA's language, essentially.
So getting your own doctor, the one who knows you best, to fill out a detailed statement specifically for the SSD case is incredibly valuable.
Hugely valuable, exactly. Their opinion, especially when it's backed up by consistent treatment records over time, is highly persuasive. They know your history.
What about testing?
Psychological testing results are also seen as important objective evidence. Things like IQ tests, memory tests, personality assessments. These provide measurable data that the SSA can sort of plug into their evaluation framework. The Blue Book listings often reference specific scores or results from these kinds of tests.
And you need to show you're trying to get better, right? Even if it's not working perfectly.
Yes, documenting your treatment response, or sometimes the lack of response, is vital. Showing you've tried different meds, different therapies, but symptoms persist or keep coming back, despite you doing your part. That demonstrates the chronic, often intractable nature of the condition. It shows it's not easily fixed.
Okay, and what about people around the applicant? Can they contribute?
Definitely. Don't underestimate the power of third-party function reports. These are statements from people who know you well, could be family, friends, even former supervisors or coworkers. They can provide concrete, real-world examples of how your condition affects you day to day. It corroborates what's in the medical records.
Like what kinds of things?
They might describe changes they've seen in your behavior, maybe social withdrawal, or maybe they can explain why you had trouble keeping your last job. It adds another layer of evidence.
Given how subjective mental health can feel, though, what are the big challenges people often run into when they're actually filing these claims?
Well, that subjectivity you mentioned leads straight to one of the biggest hurdles. Credibility issues. SSA evaluators are trying to assess symptoms they just can't see directly. So consistent, detailed descriptions of your symptoms and limitations across all your documentation, your own reports, doctor's notes, those third-party accounts we just talked about.
Yeah.
Consistency across the board is absolutely essential to build a credible case.
And we touched on this before, but treatment compliance concerns. Gaps in treatment can really hurt a claim, can't they?
They absolutely can. If there are significant gaps in your treatment history, the SSA might assume, well, maybe your condition isn't that severe, or maybe you're not following doctor's orders.
But what if there are reasons for those gaps?
That's the key. You can address this, but you have to document why there were gaps. Was it money? Could you not afford cocaine or therapy? Did medication side effects make it impossible to continue that specific treatment? Was there just a lack of available mental health professionals in your area? Explain those barriers is crucial.
Okay. What about work history? If someone has a spotty work record, maybe bounced between jobs, does that automatically count against them?
It can look concerning on the surface, yeah. But often, that spotty work history can be explained by the disability itself. You need to connect the dots, document how your symptoms, maybe anxiety making it hard to interact with customers, or depression causing chronic fatigue and you just couldn't focus, how those symptoms directly led to difficulties maintaining steady employment.
And sources mention age and education playing a role, too. How does that work?
Right. The SSA has these things called the grid rules. They use them after figuring out your RFC, your residual functional capacity, basically what you can still do despite your limitations. These grid rules factor in age, education, and past work experience. Generally speaking, it can be slightly easier for older applicants, say over 50 or 55, or those with less formal education to be found disabled.
Why is that?
The SSA assumes they might have fewer transferable skills to switch to other types of work that their limitations might still allow. Younger, more educated applicants often need to demonstrate more severe limitations to meet the criteria because the SSA assumes they have more options.
Wow. It really sounds like navigating all these challenges alone would be incredibly difficult.
It really can be overwhelming.
Which really highlights why the sources put so much emphasis on getting legal representation.
Yeah, absolutely. That statistic we mentioned earlier, the potential for up to a 40% increase in approval rates with an attorney,
Right.
it's just so compelling. And they don't just fill out forms for you. They provide crucial case development expertise. They know exactly what kind of evidence the SSA is looking for, how to gather it effectively, how to structure the argument. They can spot missing pieces in your file that you might never think of.
And given that initial denials are so common, especially for mental health claims?
Yes, that's where attorneys become vital for appeals process navigation. They know the steps inside out. Reconsideration, the hearing before administrative law judge, the appeals counsel. They can spot errors the SSA might have made in the initial evaluation, gather new evidence during the appeal, and present your case much more effectively at a hearing.
And the sources say success rates are higher at hearings.
Definitely higher at the hearing level, particularly with legal help. That's often the best chance to really explain your case fully to a judge.
Do lawyers have other advantages?
Well, some experienced attorneys also have existing relationships or networks. They might be able to refer you to qualified mental health professionals for specific evaluations if needed, ones who understand the SSA process.
And they just know the rules, right?
Exactly. Their deep SSA regulation knowledge is invaluable. These rules, policies, they change. Interpretations evolve. An attorney stays current and understands the latest policies, ensuring your application is structured in the best possible way according to current standards and precedent.
So, okay, someone's decided to apply. How should they approach the application process itself, keeping all this complexity in mind? It's definitely not just filling out a quick form online, is it?
Oh, far from it. The sources really stress that careful strategic preparation is absolutely key. For the initial application preparation, the advice is clear. Gather all your documentation before you even submit the paperwork. Don't rush.
Why not rush? Get it in quickly.
Because rushing often leads to incomplete files. And incomplete files are a major reason for initial denials. You want your strongest case presented right from the start.
So coordinating all the medical evidence is step one.
Absolutely. Robust medical evidence coordination. Request and gather every single relevant record, every doctor, therapist, hospital stay, testing center involved in your care. Make sure you get the complete files, not just summaries.
And then there's the function report. That sounds important.
It's crucial. Take your time filling out the function report. This is your main opportunity to describe in detail using specific examples, exactly how your mental health condition limits you every single day.
What kind of examples?
Think about work-related tasks specifically. Can you wake up consistently? Get ready on time? Can you focus for, say, 2 hours straight without needing a break? How do you handle deadlines or interacting with a supervisor? How does stress affect you? Unexpected changes? Be specific.
And sometimes the SSA sends you to their own doctor.
Right. Be prepared for a consultative examination, or CE, if the SSA schedules one. This is an evaluation by a doctor the SSA hires and pays. Understanding what to expect in that exam and being able to accurately describe your limitations to that doctor is really important, because their report can heavily influence the SSA's final decision.
And this whole process, it takes time, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. The sources reference timelines, and patience is required. They note an average processing time of maybe 9 to 16 months just for an initial decision. And if you have to appeal, which many people do, that obviously extends the timeline considerably longer.
We've touched on a few common questions throughout, but maybe we can quickly run through some frequently asked questions based directly on the source material.
Yeah, good idea. Let's hit the main ones.
Okay, so besides the timeline, what else do people often wonder? Like, can you work at all, maybe part-time while applying?
Okay, so limited part-time work is possible, technically, but your earnings absolutely cannot go over that substantial gainful activity threshold. We mentioned the $620 a month for 2025. And if you are working even a little, you absolutely need to discuss this with your legal representative. It's tricky, and you don't want it to jeopardize your claim.
Makes sense. What happens right after you get that initial denial letter, which sounds pretty common?
It is very common, unfortunately. But it's definitely not the end of the road. You have the right to appeal. The first step is called reconsideration. If that's denied too, the next step is requesting a hearing before an administrative law judge. And like we said, many, many cases are actually won at this hearing stage, especially if you have an attorney presenting your case.
Okay. Another question. Do you have to be seeing a psychiatrist to get approved?
It's a good question. While seeing a psychiatrist, especially for medication management and evaluations, definitely strengthens a case significantly. It's not an absolute mandatory requirement. The source material notes that consistent treatment with a licensed psychologist, combined perhaps with documentation from your primary care doctor, can also support a successful claim. Consistency and documentation are key.
Got it. And how do medication side effects factor in? We mentioned it earlier, but just to reiterate.
Yeah, worth repeating. They can actually strengthen your claim. They demonstrate additional functional limitations beyond the illness itself. So if your medication causes significant drowsiness, difficulty concentrating, maybe tremors, or other issues that interfere with potential work tasks, make absolutely sure this is thoroughly documented by your doctors. It's more evidence of impairment.
Okay. So zooming out now from all these details, what's the core takeaway from this deep dive into mental health SSD claims? What should people really remember?
I think the central message is that while proving an invisible disability, it definitely presents unique complexities compared to physical conditions.
Yeah.
These claims are absolutely winnable. They are approved every day.
Right. And success seems to hinge on a few critical things we kept coming back to. Meticulous documentation, first off. Translating that subjective experience into objective proof the SSA understands.
Yep. And strategically gathering the right kind of medical evidence, like those doctor statements.
Understanding the specific challenges inherent to psychological conditions, like credibility and compliance issues, and how to address them proactively.
And of course, recognizing the immense value that professional legal guidance can bring to navigating this whole complicated system.
It feels like just understanding the SSA's criteria and the steps involved is empowering in itself. It helps you know what you need to do to build a strong case.
It really does make a difference. Knowledge is power here.
And that brings us to a final, maybe provocative thought, drawn from the sources. The persistent difficulty in proving the work-limiting impact of conditions you can't physically see, even though there's growing recognition of them as legitimate disabilities. It highlights a broader truth, doesn't it? Our systems, maybe society too, are still adapting to the reality of mental health.
That's a really insightful way to put it. This whole journey for SSD benefits, it kind of underscores that ongoing need for awareness, for advocacy, and for continuous refinement of how we actually assess and support people dealing with these often invisible impairments.
Agreed. It's a process that truly tests persistence, as you said. Well, that's our deep dive for today. We really hope this exploration leaves you feeling much more informed and perhaps a bit more prepared for this important journey.